Good day, friends. I'm Kerry Dillinger. Welcome to Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount. We'll be looking in Matthew chapter 7, the first 12 verses, and Luke chapter 6, verses 37 through 42. If you've missed any of our previous studies in the Sermon on the Mount, I'll put a link to the playlist in the description below. So let's get our Bibles out and let's study together. Before concluding the Sermon on the Mount with alternatives that all men face, we'll study that in chapter 7, verses 13 through 27. Before that, Jesus warns us of three additional dangers that we face, namely judging, lack of discrimination in spiritual matters, and not continuing to pursue and trust God, especially through the avenue of prayer. Please note as we study these warnings how they build toward verse 12, namely the sermon brings us to a study of what we call the Golden Rule. You see on your screen an outline of chapter 7. So that's where we'll stop in today's lesson, and you can see that we'll continue, Lord willing, next time in chapter 7, verses 13 through 29, where we'll talk about the way of life. And then we'll close out our study with a recap of everything we've talked about from chapter 5 on through chapter 7 of Matthew. Jesus, in the first 5 verses, gives a warning about being judgmental. Let's hear what he has to say in the first 5 verses of chapter 7, and then we'll turn over to Luke and read those verses as well. A very well-known statement, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." We'll stop right there. Now let's turn over to Luke chapter 6, and starting in verse 37, we'll read down to verse 42. Similar words are heard. "Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." And Jesus told them a parable. "Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye,' when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You are a hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye." And so we've read the parallel passages in both Matthew and Luke. Well, these are warnings about being judgmental, but perhaps we should begin by considering what this passage is not saying. It is not commanding the disciples of Christ to hold no opinion concerning right and wrong. Hitler was evil, adultery is wrong, and deceit is a sin. These things are facts. In the next few verses, Jesus will call us to exercise some judgment concerning unworthy men and false prophets. And you can see also such passages as 1 Corinthians 5:5, Galatians 1 verse 8 and following, and Philippians 3:2. In 1 Corinthians 5:5, the church at Corinth is having problems in their congregation. A man is having sexual relations with his father's wife. Paul says you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. There's judgments having to be made there. We'll read a little bit from Galatians chapter 1. Let's start in verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul also writes this in Philippians 3:2, look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, look out for those who mutilate the flesh. So every form of judging, then, is not forbidden. Being judgmental or having a prejudiced attitude, well, that's condemned. Jesus is condemning that. Be careful and listen to what we're saying. It's being judgmental or having a prejudiced attitude that Jesus is condemning. As Christians, we must practice discernment, but we do not have free rein to criticize. Jesus says if we're judgmental, then we'll be treated in a judgmental way by others, and when it comes down to it, we will truly be judged by God. In these verses, Christ is restating a point he already has made twice in our study. See Matthew 5:7 and Matthew 6, verses 14 and following. And the point he's already made twice is that a judgmental attitude excludes us from God's pardon. Jesus is not saying we can earn mercy by being merciful, but we can exclude ourselves from mercy by having an attitude that is the opposite of the poverty of spirit. Now we're ready to examine the example of the speck and the beam. King David is a prime candidate for the Speck and Beam Hall of Fame. You know the story. He took Uriah the Hittite's wife and later had Uriah the Hittite murdered. Time passes. Along comes Nathan the prophet and tells him a story. See 2 Samuel 12, 1-7. In that story, David becomes very angry at the protagonist of that story, and that's when Nathan the prophet utters those words, "You are the man." We can fall under the same condemnation when we condemn the sins of others while we're out practicing similar behavior. Or, when we're in doctrinal disputes, we become more concerned with the winning of the argument than saving our soul and the soul of our brother. We must be willing and able to put our own house in order before we can be qualified to help others. Note, we are not to condemn. That shouldn't be our first move. The verses in Luke confirm the scriptural precept of reaping as you sow, as it applies to judging, giving, teaching, or receiving a teacher. Verse 38 in Luke indicates that an abundance will be returned to the one who gives abundantly. In the Old King James, it says, "Give into your bosom." That's the return you will receive. And that is a reference to the ancient custom of carrying items inside your cloak. For an example, See Ruth 3, verse 15. In the Luke reading, verse 39 has a broad application, including those who would teach the gospel. The blind cannot lead the blind, and the pupil, the student, can only rise to the level of his teacher. Therefore, the best teacher must be sought. While the Matthew passage concerns being judgmental, the Luke passage concerns the teacher and his attitude toward his pupil. Obviously, the end of both is the attitude of the corrector, be it as a teacher or as a brother. Let's read one more verse. We've already heard from Paul the Apostle concerning the dogs. What does Jesus say about the dogs? Well, in Matthew 7, verse 6, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and then turn and attack you. Even though the greater danger lies in being judgmental, we must be wary of being undiscerning. The dogs and pigs under consideration here are not household pets, but they're semi-wild animals, and the example of swine would be especially an abomination to the Jews who were listening to the sermon. And of course, the majority of that crowd were Jews. The two together represent people who are savage, the dogs and the pigs. These people are savage, vicious, devoid of manners, irresponsible, unappreciative, and just flat out profane. The Apostle Peter wrote in his second letter, chapter 2, verse 22, what the true proverb says has happened to these false teachers. The dog returns to its own vomit, and the sow, after washing herself, returns to wallow in the mire. And then we hear of the pearls, and the pearls and that which is sacred represent the gospel, namely the truth. Jesus tells us to withhold the truth from such as these. See Matthew 15:14. He says these people come along, these so-called dogs and pigs. Let them alone. They're blind guides. And as we have already read in Luke, if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. The warning continued in the ministry and teaching of the Apostle Paul. In Acts chapter 15, which I'll leave for you to read, in Titus 3:10. I said Acts 15, I meant Acts 18, and I will read a little bit of that to you. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. And then in Titus 3:10 and 11, as for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful. He is self-condemned. Here's a chart that I found, or made, I should say, by reading D.A. Carson in his book, The Sermon on the Mount, pages 105 to 107. 5 implications of Christ's teaching in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 6. In other words, the verse we've just read. Note 1. Jesus said, pearls. Do not cast your pearls before swine. He didn't say gravel, and that shows us that the pearls indicate the value of the gospel. Then we see that some will reject these pearls. And we understand, as we will read in Matthew 7:13, that mankind will be divided by the gospel. The gospel is not to be presented to those who mock, argue, and ridicule, I should say, as Jesus says here in verse 6. Why? Our time would be better spent elsewhere. And not everyone who initially balks or mocks is a swine or a dog. Some can be brought into the kingdom and converted. Finally, this passage is not an excuse for us to stop sowing the seeds of the kingdom, which implies using spiritual discretion and discernment does not mean to stop trying to teach the gospel. Let's carry on with our reading from Matthew 7, this time verses 7 through 11. And by the way, I'm reading from the ESV today. I hope you're reading from whichever of the versions you prefer. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks you for a fish, will you give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Warnings against lacking a trusting persistence and prayer encouraged. Here, Jesus is warning his listeners against being the seed that falls on the stony ground. Do you remember the parable of the sower in Matthew 13? Jesus says, as for what was sown on rocky ground or stony ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arise on account of the word, he immediately falls away. You can find the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9. And if you've forgotten it, I suggest you pause the video and go give it a reading. A simple lack of staying power, coupled with an attitude of I can do it by myself, will lead to an early departure from the faith. So Jesus tells us to keep on asking, keep on seeking, and keep on knocking. We need to be persistent. But we need to be persistent in what? Well, the answer is prayer. And this prayer is a divinely empowered response to God's invitation of Jeremiah 29 and verse 13, in which we see God's promise through Jeremiah to the exiles. You will seek me and find me, and when you seek me with all your heart. In other words, let me read that again with a different emphasis. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. If we lack the things that are required in the kingdom, namely, if we lack poverty of spirit, purity of heart, the Beatitudes, if we lack those, then we must ask for them. This asking, seeking, and knocking involves a complete quest for the kingdom and God's righteousness. And our prayer lives must be broadened. We must be in a constant attitude of prayer. As Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, we need to be praying without ceasing. And this attitude must be one in accordance with God's will. In his short letter, James, the Lord's brother, had this to say in James 4, beginning in the second half of the second verse: You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. If we embody the first beatitude, we will be eager to look to God for the help we will need to enter and remain in the kingdom. Some seem frightened to approach God the Father in prayer. Yet the words of the Lord here in Matthew 7 are meant to allay our fears. He says if human fathers, who are evil compared to God, if human fathers can give good gifts, then how much better will the gifts of the Heavenly Father be? He has promised to never forget his people. In Isaiah 49:15, the prophet says, "Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb?" Well, even these may forget, the Lord says, yet I will not forget you. Let's close out our lesson by looking at two more verses. We'll begin in Matthew 7 and verse 12. This will be a familiar passage to everyone. "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." And in Luke 6:31, it reads this way. Let me turn there. "And as you wish that others would do to you, do also to them." So we hear what we call the golden rule, and it's the summary of the moral law. Everything that Christ says up to here can be summarized in this verse. Do you know that philosophers such as Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, and Hillel have incorporated a version of this rule into their teaching? And their version says, "Do not do to others what you would not have done to you." Well, that's different than what Jesus said. Jesus said what to do. And the other philosophers, these so-called philosophers, have said what not to do. "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," is what Jesus said. The others have said, "Do not do to others what you would not have done to you." Well, an essential part of true religion, then, is righteousness toward our fellow man. If this righteousness is our rule, then we must be ruled by it. In our dealings with others, we must be just, fair, honest, lovely, and of good report. Just knowing and believing is not enough. We must be willing to do. Do that which Christ commands us toward God, toward Christ, toward the Father, toward our brethren, toward our fellow man. We are to do good to our neighbor and not return evil for evil. This part of the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And I should say this is part of the second greatest commandment, namely, love your neighbor as yourself. The meaning of the rule can be seen in three things, and we'll list those three things, and the lesson will be yours. We must treat our neighbor in a way that we judge as correct. Our neighbor must be put on an even plane with ourselves, and we must put ourselves in our neighbor's place and deal with them from that point of view. Well, why should this rule be enforced? Jesus said it is the law and the prophets. And while the golden rule is not directly quoted from either the law or the prophets, it is the basic teaching of both of those in a nutshell. Beware. While the law of Christ is commended to the world through this rule, Christians not complying with the rule do stand condemned. Thank you for studying with me today. I hope that these lessons on the Sermon on the Mount are profitable. They certainly are to me as I go through my notes for perhaps the third or fourth time since I first wrote them years ago. Come back and be with us soon. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, I wish you would. If you would even give this video a like or a dislike. And if you would share a link to the video with someone you know who would be interested in studying along with us in this series. I hope you have a wonderful week. We hope to be back in just a day or two with another lesson from Bible class topics. Until then, may God bless.